Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called 4 Encounters with Gray Aliens. Grays are by far the most commonly reported type of extraterrestrial. Many of the cases have striking similarities, however they also have very significant differences. Each person is of course unique and reacts uniquely to their experience. But because grays are so common, I think it's important we learn all we can about them. And that's why I wanted to do this video, which portrays 4 different people's encounters with gray aliens. Each of these cases, I think, illustrate the various commonalities and variations between gray type encounters. First case I'd like to talk about, I call the alien outside the window, Connie Lopez's encounter. In 1969, Connie Lopez was living with her husband in Arleta, California, a small suburb outside of Los Angeles. She had 3 children. She had a 4-year-old girl, a 2-year-old girl, and had just given birth to her son. He was 2 weeks old and a newborn, and they decided that they were going to set his crib up in the master bedroom in the corner where they could keep a close eye on him. So that's what they did. They set up his crib next to a large picture window, hung a little mobile above the crib, and kept a close eye on him. And he was about 2 weeks old when a very unnerving incident happened. Connie woke up in the middle of the night to hear a strange sound. It was like fingers rubbing against glass, making a squeaky sound. And she looked around and noticed the source of the noise and got the most profound shock in her life. A gray alien was standing outside the window looking at her son, and it was trying to open the window by rubbing its fingers against the glass. She had no idea what gray aliens were. She had never heard of them or seen anything like this. All she knew was that this was a humanoid figure and it was not human. She described it as being about 6 feet tall. It had a large head, dark wraparound eyes. She didn't notice any real nose or mouth, couldn't see any ears. She couldn't tell if it was wearing anything, or she could see that it was tall and slender and had long, thin arms. And what she noticed most was its hands. It had very long fingers, and on its fingers were these weird suction cup-like protrusions. Very much, she said, like an octopus has on its tentacles. That's what it reminded her of. These suction cups were lined along the insides of its fingers, and it was doing its best to use these suction cup-like things to try and open this window. What's very interesting is that this window doesn't open. It's fixed to the wall. Apparently this gray ET wasn't smart enough to figure this out. Hard to say. But as soon as Connie realized that this was not human and it was trying to get her baby, she became very frightened. It was looking down at her baby, didn't even see her or pay any attention to her. It was just looking at her child and then looking up at the mobile. And Connie sat up in bed and went to jump up and scoop up her child, at which point she found herself slammed back into the bed by a strange force. As she says, there was something keeping me down from getting up. I remember the pressure. I was trying to hold on to the mattress and force myself up. It wouldn't let me come up. I couldn't even call my husband. I couldn't yell. I couldn't do anything. I was numb, paralyzed. I just couldn't move. I could feel I was crying because I could feel the tears coming out of my eyes. I remember all I kept thinking is, oh my God, he wants to take my baby. The strange gray figure walked back and forth a few times, did its best to try and open this window that could not be opened, and after a few minutes, finally just walked off. Connie instantly leaped out of bed and screamed, scooped up her son, her husband jumped out of bed and asked her what was wrong, and Connie explained what had happened, that some strange being was outside the window and wanted to kidnap their baby. She felt it was after their baby. And he said, well, I think you probably just had a dream. And she said, no, it was not a dream. It was too real. Uh, he did his best to comfort her, but it was obvious that he was skeptical. In the morning, Connie was still upset, and she told her husband she's taking the children and the baby, and she's going to go stay at her grandmother's or her mother's house for a few days. And that's what she did. For the next 3 days, she stayed away from the house completely, and finally came back, but told her husband that she wanted to get some guard dogs. And he agreed, and they bought 2 guard dogs. But even that wasn't enough. Connie was still traumatized by this encounter, and she told her husband that she wanted to move. And by now he knew the cause of her anxiety, and being the loving husband he was, he agreed, and they sold their house and moved. They moved to another house in the same neighborhood, but Connie was no longer comfortable in that house. She said she just did not feel safe. So this case is a good example of how traumatizing a UFO encounter can be. Interestingly, it was Connie's one and only encounter. She's never seen a UFO. She'd never had an encounter before or since. Neither has anyone in her family, including her son, who was the target, apparently, of this gray alien. So she didn't even know what to make of it for years. It wasn't until years later that she started seeing this stuff in the media that she began to wonder. And what actually really convinced her was she and I worked in the same office, and she walked into my office one day and saw a figurine, a little figurine, a statue of a gray alien. She pointed at it and screamed and asked me, "What is that?" I'm like, "Connie, that's a gray alien. What do you think it is?" And that's how I learned about her encounter. So yeah, I think these gray alien encounters are not only the most common, they're fairly common in general. I think they're a lot more common than people realize, and that many, many people are having this type of experience. Second encounter I'd like to talk about, I call Marked by the Grays, Kim Kamen's encounter. In 1994, Kim Kamen was 39 years old. He had recently retired from the Army. He worked as an aircraft mechanic for Special Forces, but had retired and was living with his wife in his home in Bourbonnais, Illinois, when he had an incredible encounter with gray extraterrestrials. He was lying in his bed when he heard a voice wake him up. It said, "Get up and come with us." Kevin woke up and saw a gray ET standing next to his bed. It repeated itself, "Get up and come with us. We're not going to hurt you. Just relax. It's okay." And Kevin was surprised to find himself stand up and obey this gray. And at that point he saw that there were actually 3 of them, 2 by the foot of the bed, and they began to march him out into his living room. As he says, "I was in somewhat of a shock, kind of amazed or awed. All I know is I got up and walked out. I really wasn't scared. I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't like I had control of myself. They said, 'Come with us,' and I did. It wasn't like I really had much of a choice." He describes them as being about 3 foot tall, large bald heads, dark wraparound eyes, no really visible nose or mouth. He didn't see any ears or any jumpsuit. He recognized them instantly as gray aliens because he had seen them before on TV several times, but still he was surprised by how alien, how non-human they actually looked. So he walks out into the living room and got another real shock. The back wall of his living room had disappeared. It was completely gone, invisible, or was like a hole in his house. This is certainly something I've heard in many other cases. As one woman described to me, it was like the walls opened like levolor blinds. So this is what Kim was describing. And these three grays led him out into his backyard. He could feel the wet grass on his bare feet, and looking up, he was amazed to see a huge metallic gray silver flying saucer. He said it had beautiful colored lights blinking around the perimeter, red, blue, green, and yellow. They were very vivid, and it kind of just entranced and hypnotized him. The Greys walked him over until he was under this craft, which was just a few hundred feet up. There was a very large bright in the center bottom of the craft, and suddenly it sent out a bright beam of light which struck Kim. And next thing Kim knows, he's inside a small room, apparently inside this thing, laying out on a table. As Kim says, and I'm quoting, "It was a circular round room. All I can remember is being on this steel or concrete-like slab, like an autopsy table. I've never been into an autopsy room, but it kind of looked like that. It was a plain room." He didn't see any of the Greys at this point. All he could really see was the ceiling above him, and he was shocked and a little bit scared to see a weird instrument open out from the ceiling and come telescoping down towards him. This is when he felt his first real fear. As Kim says, it was kind of like a power tool type of deal, stretching down from the ceiling. I don't remember any of the beings being there. They probably were. I was just focused on this thing coming down from the ceiling. And at this point he started to feel a little fear, and he passed out, or they knocked him unconscious. He's not sure. Next thing he knows, he's back in his bed. He instantly grabs his arm for some reason. He's not sure why, until he sees that there's a strange triangular mark on his left forearm, on the inside of his left forearm, about 3 inches down from the elbow. It was very apparent. It was a perfect triangle, perfect equilateral triangle, about a 1/4 inch on each side. It was bright red and indented into his skin. Though it wasn't painful, it wasn't inflamed. It was very obvious, and it wasn't there before. He's certainly positive about that. So he instantly called up his wife, who was working the night shift at the local hospital, and told her what happened. And she was shocked and told him she'd be home in a few hours. He ended up calling her more than once while waiting for her to come home. She finally comes home and comforted him as best as she could. He was pretty traumatized by the whole thing. Had no experience with UFOs or extraterrestrials prior to this. He did have one sighting, but it was off in the distance with a large group of people, and he didn't feel any real special connection to it. However, after this experience, he did recall that his brother, his fraternal twin brother, also claimed to have had an encounter, not with Greys, but with a praying mantis type of extraterrestrial. So perhaps there's a connection there, he wondered. I think he's probably right. I think this probably explains why he was contacted. Perhaps the ETs were interested in his genetics, him being a twin. I say this because there does seem to be a high incidence of twins among the contactee population. This could be a coincidence. I'm just speculating here. But whatever the reason, Kim was left with a very obvious mark on his arm. And that's another strange aspect which I do see somewhat frequently among these types of encounters. People are left with some sort of mark on their arm, and a triangle is certainly common among these types of marks. So Kim was pretty upset by the encounter. He didn't feel it was particularly scary, but it just really surprised him. And he thought it might be a good idea for him to go visit his psychiatrist and talk about it. So that's what he did. He called up the local VA hospital and decided to make an appointment with a psychiatrist, which he did. And the psychiatrist told him that he listened to the story and said, well, I don't think it's psychosomatic. There's very obviously this mark on your arm, and you can look at it one of two ways. You can either deny this happened and let it bother you, or you can just accept it and move on with your life. It was kind of an interesting reaction because the doctor didn't seem surprised or skeptical of Kim's story. So it's an interesting, I think, element to this case, certainly. And the fact that Kim was in Special Forces is also an interesting detail, and makes me wonder if perhaps that had something to do with him being contacted. Although he was retired, it's hard to say. At any rate, this did have a very profound effect on Kim. He became very interested in UFOs following this and often watched UFO programs on TV. And one day he got what he believes is corroboration of his encounter. Another abductee was talking about what he had experienced and said that following his encounter, he was left with a triangular mark on his arm. And they showed this mark on the television screen. As Kim says, and I'm quoting, "They showed the triangle. I thought I was going to crap in my pants at that moment. It was like ice went down my back looking at that. I was like, oh my God." And my wife just looked at me and said, "Hey, that's the same mark you have on your arm, isn't it?" Yup, it was the same mark that I had on my arm. I always thought there were extraterrestrials out there, but when it happened to me, I am convinced. I am very solidly convinced of it now. So although Kim's encounter was somewhat frightening, he does not believe that these Greys are evil, and he doesn't feel like his experience was bad. He feels it was actually benevolent. As he says, "It was a little scary, but I wouldn't call it an unpleasant experience. If I had to go through it again, I probably would, because they didn't hurt me. I don't know what they did. If they put an implant in me or not, I can't say. I wasn't forced into doing anything. No anal probes, but I know they put a mark on my arm, and it was a pretty good-sized mark." So I told that case in my book, Onboard UFO Encounters. And it's very similar to other cases, but again, also has some interesting and unique elements. Third case I'd like to talk about, I call Healed by Greys, Natalie's encounter. In 2017, I was contacted by Natalie. That's a pseudonym. She did not want her real name used. Natalie lives in Norway, where she used to be a graphic artist, but today works in human rights and social activism, this sort of thing. And back in 1991, she worked as a graphics artist and had suffered a severe injury to her neck and back. It was causing her all kinds of problems, and she wasn't sure what she was going to do about it. And that's when she had this very interesting encounter with 3 gray extraterrestrials. And I'll just let Natalie describe what happened to her in her own words. As she says, "I woke up one night with a terrible pain in my back, and I realized that I couldn't move. I discovered my bed was surrounded by little grays. One was taller and was doing some surgery on my back. They flipped me on my back like I was a rag doll. I was terrified. They didn't say anything. The non-communication scared me. And they left through the wall. Outside there was a bluish light, and then I could move again. And I went straight to the window. Everything looked different, even the nature. It was like looking into another dimension. Then suddenly the light was gone, and everything was normal." Natalie was stunned, and she stumbled back to bed and sat down, and that's when she realized something incredible. She no longer felt any pain in her back. As she says, "The amazing part was that my back pain from my injury was gone and never came back. Whatever this was, it has healed me and made my life a lot easier. I became a lot more interested in UFOs and ETs, or interdimensional beings. I also became a vegetarian and animal rights activist, and more politically active in human rights issues, environmental protection, and peace activism. I find this very interesting because this is a pattern I've noticed with other cases. People who are being contacted, or in particular healed, are often people who are doing good work for humanity in some capacity, whether it's a teacher, a doctor, a police officer, or a social worker, this sort of thing. And that's certainly true in Natalie's case. Also interesting is that Natalie has no prior history of UFO encounters. Like Connie and like Kim, she was never visited as a child by gray ETs. Usually people who have an encounter with gray aliens, they will describe childhood encounters, but this did not happen to Natalie, Kim, or Connie. So I find that kind of interesting. I told Natalie's story in my book, The Healing Power of UFOs, and it's one of more than 300 cases of people who have been healed by ETs, which is why I think this is definitely one of their agendas, and this case illustrates that. And by the way, while Natalie never had any other visitations by Greys, she did have a couple of distant sightings, and she did have one interesting experience while she was driving late at night. She says she was driving in a rural area when she heard a calm female voice say very clearly, "Elk could be here." And I'll just let Natalie describe what happened next in her own words. As she says, "Instinctively I pulled the brakes and stopped the car as soon as I could. Out of nowhere, an elk came across the road and literally jumped over the hood of my tiny Daihatsu car. I got mud from the elk's hooves on my front window. So whatever the voice came from, it saved my life." So again, we have another encounter with gray ETs, but as you can see, each case has strong similarities and significant differences. And the fourth and final encounter I'd like to talk about, I call Making Friends with ETs, Harry Williams Encounter. In 1995, Harry Williams worked as a car mechanic. He lived in a town with his wife and his parents. The town was Vandalia, Ohio, a small town. And one evening he was driving home with his wife when they saw something strange ahead of them, hovering over the road. It was just about 20 feet up, hovering right above the road off to the side a little bit. And it was a perfectly round, spherical-shaped craft. And as they approached it, it became immediately apparent that this was a UFO, because there was a large picture window, and through this huge round window in front, he could see two gray extraterrestrials. I'll just let Harry describe what he saw in his own words. As Harry says, "You could see the whole spacecraft. You could see that opening right there. It was like plastic, and you could see the both of them sitting there. There were two of them. One of them was sitting on each side, and one had his hand on the controls in the middle. I suppose that's what they operated the spaceship with. I don't know. They had their hands there. I could see their arms and their little hands. That's how close I was. You could see the controls. It was like a T control." Harry turned to his wife and said, "Look, honey, there's aliens in it. There they are. Look." His wife took one look at this thing and screamed and looked away and started begging Harry to drive off. Harry, however, was very intrigued and slowed the car down to a near stop, and as it came right alongside this thing, just stared right back at these gray ETs who were looking directly at him. As Harry says, They didn't say a word. What was so fascinating were these black eyes, big black eyes and a big gray head. It just fascinated me because it looked like they could look right through your living soul. And yet it was a calm type thing. They didn't make any action or movement with their arms or anything. They had those big black eyes, and they had a little nose with two little holes in it, hardly any nose at all. And then they had the lower part of their mouth. That's how close I was. All I could see was just their heads and arms. And they were gray. I could not see anything on their bodies. I couldn't see any clothes at all, just gray figures. They were looking right at me. I could feel like they were almost looking right through me. It was kind of scary, and I thought, well, I'm just going to keep on looking at them. And Harry would have kept on looking at them had his wife not gone into complete hysterics and just begging and screaming for him to race away. And finally he relented and drove off. To his surprise, the object followed them. And he sped up the car, and this object sped up and actually followed them all the way home, more than a mile. And he screeched into the driveway. His wife immediately fled into the house, but Harry called out his parents and other family members who saw this object, which had now risen several hundred feet up so that you couldn't see the grays or the window itself, but you could definitely see this strange glowing object. And he's like, look, it's a UFO. And everyone seemed impressed. It was clearly unexplained, but as they all walked, this object darted upwards, and they went back inside, and everyone just kind of forgot about the entire incident. And it was never really discussed after that for a long time. It was this encounter that really woke Harry up to the fact that he was having contact, because after it happened, he remembered many other things in his life that were very strange. This particular encounter really changed his life. As he says, it's just something that I'll always remember for the rest of my life. I mean, it seemed like they were so smart. You can just tell. They almost looked through your living soul, thinking you're an ignorant thing or what, but yet they still, in a way, want to talk to you. And after having this encounter, Harry started to examine some curious incidents that had occurred to him as a child and a young adult. He remembered at age 6 being visited by a strange glowing purple entity in his bedroom. And following that, he started to have a real fear of being kidnapped or taken away. It was so bad he had trouble sleeping at night and could only fall asleep if he hid under his bed or underneath piles and piles of blankets, or even slept in between the mattresses themselves. On other occasions, he would just leave his bed and his bedroom completely and go and sleep under the stairwell. So this really caused him some trauma, but he didn't know where it was coming from. And this lasted into adulthood, his strange sleeping habits and this fear of intruders and being kidnapped. He was never able to really pinpoint where it was coming from, though. He also had other strange effects. He remembered a feeling of being watched. This was something that was very strong and was all through his childhood and into adulthood and continues today, this feeling of being observed. At the time, he didn't know where it was coming from or what to make of it, but it was definitely causing problems for him. As a young adult, he had other strange experiences. He was a teenager, and he had the rare opportunity of being alone in the house with a couple of older brothers. That was not common. But on this occasion, in 1962, while he was a teenager, he did have a very unusual encounter on their 7-acre farm in a rural area. He again was alone in the house when a UFO landed in the backyard, in the forest behind their house. He couldn't see the object itself. All he could see was a very bright white light in the forest, but it was 200-300 feet long and extremely bright. I said, whatever it was, it must have been the size of an airliner. And he was very intrigued, fascinated, and decided he's going to go hike out there and see what it is. And he got close to it, and that's when he started to feel a strange fear. And it wasn't, he felt, coming from him. He felt like it was coming from the object, almost as if it was being exerted upon him. Because as he would take steps closer and closer, this fear mounted and became so intense that it actually paralyzed him and left him so weak that he was unable to make any further steps forward. And he turned around and stepped back, and the fear left. And when he tried to go back to it again, the fear returned. So he feels like it was some strange effect that they were exerting on him. At any rate, he ended going back into his house and watching from the window. This object stayed for over an hour, and finally it just blinked out. So that was a strange incident. Another strange thing he does remember is a couple of episodes of missing time. I could just never figure out where the time was going. Suddenly it would be early in the evening, and next thing he knew it would be late. So that was weird. And that continued throughout his young adulthood and into adulthood, but sort of tapered off at some point. And then in 1985, he has this really, really profound encounter. And following this, he not only realized he was in contact with UFOs, but they began to appear regularly. Often they would appear when he went outside to work, or when he came out of his place of employment, they would appear again. And on each occasion, they would follow him to or from his home. And this happened many, many times, dozens of times over the next 20 years. These objects would just appear and follow him in his car. As he says, I get ready to go to work, and here these craft would be following me. They would be following me to work and following me home. Some of them were real close, so close. And I got so scared, of course. I had to keep an eye on the road. They never hurt me, they just followed me. And certainly in the morning, they'd be waiting here. I'd get outside and get ready to go in my car and go on the highway, and I could see them on the left-hand side. And when I went ahead and started driving down the highway, the lights just kept following me down the highway. At first, Harry was a little bit unnerved by being stalked by a UFO, but after dozens of experiences like this, he not only became used to it, he kind of looked forward to it in a weird way. As he says, it's weird. In a way, I looked forward to it. In a way, they're like buddies. Like, here we are. I don't know if the UFOs seem to like me or they follow me around. I have no idea what's going on. But yeah, this happened over and over again. And sometimes they would get close. Often it was off up in the distance. Sometimes he could step out into his backyard and he could see these star-like objects way up there, and it was pretty apparent to him that they weren't stars, because they were unusually bright, and they would send down little spikes or beams of light, little rays of light. He was absolutely convinced that they were kind of keeping an eye on him. So now he knows who's watching him, and on a few occasions they did come very close. In 2001, he stepped out into his backyard one evening, and sure enough, there was one of these weird objects way up there. He called his wife out to tell her to come outside and look. She refused. She reminded him she doesn't like to talk about UFOs. And at that moment, one of these objects just dropped down out of the sky and hovered right above his house. As Harry says, and I'm quoting, I was just playing around. Then there it was. I said, here it comes. I about died. I couldn't believe it. This UFO was on top of me, and I mean in about 2 to 3 seconds. It just came right down out of the sky, and it was right on top of my house. It was bright, like a big dish that was upside down, a bright light type of thing. Harry stared for just a few seconds, at which point this object darted straight upwards and resumed its star-like appearance. He called out to his wife to come and look, but she gently reminded him that she does not like to talk about UFOs. So this was the sort of thing that would periodically happen to him. He had another very close encounter in 2005 when he was driving home one evening and this object followed him. And this time it came very, very close to his car, so close that it scared him badly. And he uh, quickly parked his car and got into the house. He was alone, and he turned off all the lights and looked outside the window, and this object had actually landed next to his house on the street in an intersection right next to his house. He said it was very, very bright and quite large. It had to be, he's estimating, about 150 feet wide. He couldn't really see any detail, just a very bright, bright light, but it covered the entire expanse of the intersection, the entire span of the intersection. And he was just too terrified to go outside. As he says, that was about the scariest yet. It was neat, them following me home. Like, here it is. I really see them. But when it kept following and following, it wasn't neat anymore. It wasn't funny anymore. I was in a complete panic, just completely scared to death. My hands were shaking. My skin was sweaty. This object actually stayed parked there for, he estimates, over an hour, maybe 2 hours. He was too scared to investigate. He would just peek out the window every now and then. And after an hour or two, he peeked out and it was gone. He was sure he was about to be abducted, but it just didn't happen, or at least he doesn't remember it happening. So despite his strong fear reaction to some of these cases, he still feels like these guys are friendly. He feels like they're benevolent, and he calls them his friends, his buddies. He also feels that they have contributed to something very interesting in him physiologically. Although he's quite elderly, he enjoys outstanding good health. He went to the doctor, and the doctor was shocked to see how healthy he was. That it told him his heart was like a teenager in his lungs. That he was just in fantastic good health. And this is something Harry attributes to his relationship with these gray ETs. As he says, I think maybe since I've had contact with these UFO people, they gave me more strength, or I have more vitality. I don't know whether that has anything to do with that. I was thinking something happened. Maybe they gave me something in my veins that caused me to be so healthy. I find this interesting because certainly there are many other cases like this. Many other people have told me the same thing, that they've enjoyed outstanding good health, and even into quite old age. And that's certainly true in Harry's case. Another interesting detail about Harry's case is that he reports a series of visions and precognitive dreams about natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods. He's pretty much convinced that at some point the state of Florida, half of it, will be underwater. He does predict that there will be widespread natural disasters across our planet. And this is something that certainly turns up in other cases. When anyone gets a message from the UFO people, that's often what it is. So again, I think this speaks towards the Greys' agenda and their obvious concern for our planet. I told Harry's case in my book, Inside UFOs, along with Connie's case. And I think these cases show how amazingly similar encounters with Greys can be, and yet how different and unique they can also be. I think they have important things to say about these Grey type ETs that are visiting our planet. For example, I think Connie's encounter reveals the ET's interest in reproduction. I've talked to many women who've had encounters when they were 8, 9 months pregnant, usually, or had just had their baby. So that's something I see quite often, and that's certainly true in Connie's case. And with Kim Kammen's encounter, I find his interesting because he is a fraternal twin, And there is a high incidence of twins within the experiencer community. And I'm wondering if that is a factor. I also find it interesting that he received that strange triangular mark on his arm, which again is something I've certainly heard from other witnesses. Natalie's encounter also is interesting because, like Connie and Kim, she had no prior encounters. And I don't know why that would be when generally that's the rule. People who have an encounter with gray type ETs usually do have encounters in their childhood, but that's just not true for the first three cases in this particular presentation. So that's interesting. And another interesting thing is that Natalie was healed. Again, that's something that turns up in a number of cases. And the fact that she's a human rights activist and working for peace and animal rights and the environment is again something I see quite often among contactees. So that may be significant. And moving on to Harry's encounter, I think Harry's encounter is interesting because it shows how people can have a lifelong relationship with greys. That's usually what happens. And shows how it can be very scary, and yet people can also feel like they have a benevolent relationship with ETs. Harry did ask his parents if they'd had encounters, and at first they denied it. But on her deathbed, Harry's mom revealed that she too had an experience where was in her car driving and had been paced by a UFO for several miles. So that again, that's a pattern that turns up in a number of these cases where ETs do seem to show an interest in families and are tracking people generationally. So that's another important aspect which Harry's case illustrates. So yeah, some very interesting commonalities, some very significant differences. And because grays are so common, I think it's very important we learn about them. And again, that's why I put together this video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks once again for watching and keep having fun.